Hey everyone, so today we'll be diving into some tips, do's and don'ts while you are developing your web apps or mobile apps, and we will focus on web technologies, but this also applies to other platforms like iOS or Android. But of course, the concepts are the same, but still some changes and differences. But that's fine, they should be still applied there also. And of course, basically nowadays everything is a component which renders components, which also renders components. But how should we do and develop them so that we can make our development and also our apps scale while we are adding more features and more features and more features? So pretty much that's it. Let's do it. So basically, I would like to start with I think there's a good approach, which is the top down approach um, to um, to develop your components. So, for example, if you are developing a list of cards which are users, for example, and that card has an image and some text, and here you have another card. So, how you would go about this is you have this, but you should think about this card as something that you can reuse, right? And any other component as you want to reuse. So basically, we saw some years ago like a transition to think about everything as a component. So for example, this one is a component, right? The text part is a component, the image part is a component, then the card is a component, and then the list is a component, and then the page around it is a component. And if you think like that, now you need to create the image component, which will be, for example, a component that can be rendered as a circle or as a square, for example. Then it receives an image, right? And it can receive the shape, for example. So that would be it, right? Um, and then you have the text component, right, which could also have the direction or something like that, where you will say that there's a left direction, there's something in the middle, and there's also a right align, for example. So this would be the align property or something like that. And then, of course, you have the font size, font family, which I will assume that you just, the font family, especially, you will just do one or two, and then you put it at the top level of your app, and that's it. But now you want to create a card, right? So then you would basically you create a card, and that card receives some props, which can be the children, for example, or actually props. It depends on your technology of choice, but and then you would render it the other components as you want. So the parent decides where you want to define or render the component. And here, of course, you could think about this card, or you can think about another card where you put like this, right? So you put the picture in the top, then the text in the bottom, and the responsibility of the card component is to lay out the child components, so basically the inner components. And that's basically it. So you first go to a top-down approach, you see your components, you define them, and then you start by creating the smaller components, which should be the dummy components, where they just basically render stuff, right? An image, render text, then receive a couple of properties to do some tweaks here and there, like the alignment or the image shape or the alignment. So yeah, pretty much that's it. And then you start to build from bottom up, right? And that basically that's it. So now a second topic is that while you do that, there's two things I think you need to be aware. So one of them is when you start to do a lot of hard-coded values, and these ones we can think about them as, for example, widths, height. Then you do margins, right, or paddings. That's pretty much it. And when you start to do a lot of hard-coded stuff, you should start to think about it. So you should say, okay, maybe there's another way. Because, for example, let's go back again to the cards, and you have like these lists, right? And you have the card, and the card has an image, and there's text. So thinking about just the card, if you start, for example, when you start to develop the picture element, if you start to give margins to these picture here and margins here, because you are just thinking about the card, Then if you want to do some other component which also uses the text or the image, then you, if you hard code the margins on the these components, then you will need to tweak it. And what I propose is that you do these tweaks through properties that you pass to the component. So there are also libraries that do that for you, so that you just import them and then suddenly your components are already inheriting these properties so that you can tweak it. So I would say, for example, for the margins and also for the paddings, that's nice to have. And of course, as you saw in the previous videos, you can build your team and follow strict rules for margins, paddings, and all of that, depending on your rules. But the way you should basically design them is in that way, because then when you reuse the smaller components, so the child components, then you pass from the parent the properties that you want to tweak. And then, of course, if you do not have anymore a card, but you have maybe a bigger card, then the image will receive different margins, right? And the text will receive different margins. Because, for example, this one was a list of friends, for example, but here you have a list, your user, for example, your user profile. So then these margins here, right? These margins here and paddings, whatever, they are different, right? So that would be the way to avoid it. And what can we do instead of hard coding these? Or and for example, also for the example of the width. So for example, if the card has 200 pixels here, then here maybe you want something with 400 pixels, and you are hard coding it at this level here. And then now you want to create some profile cards, and then you are stick with the 200s, and then you need to tweak it. So here I think we should avoid like all hard-coded stuff, and then use also different types of units. So I would go, for example, for the widths and heights, right? And then I would go with favoring, basically you should favor flex and also grid stuff, right? So these ones we can already start to move towards it. And then you can basically create ratios, right, between your components. So, and that's much better. Then you can also control the orientation. So if it's a row, if it's a column, etc. And that can be, it's much more flexible. And of course, for the margins and paddings, there's also, so margins and paddings, there's also CSS units, right? And let's focus on that one. So you have a couple of CSS units, and these ones you can use absolute ones, right? And you can also have the relative ones. And I think we should favor relative. So for example, the absolute ones are like pixels, right? Pixels are absolute. And then the relative part is like percentages. Let's say rems, ems, then you have VH, VW. So all the relative stuff, we should favor these ones, because it makes it's simpler to achieve a little bit of responsiveness and fluid designs with these units. And of course, in conjunction, using flex, grids, these relative CSS units, then you can, it's easier to build it. And of course, I'm assuming a little bit that we want to do some responsive design. So you also can use media queries, right? And here you can use media queries and also the container queries. But nowadays, I think we can more and more get rid of media queries and container queries, because now with flags, with relative units that are available, you can also rely less on these constructs or media queries, and also achieve the same responsiveness or fluid design. So that's nice. And of course, assuming that you are doing some responsiveness, then I would also go with a mobile first approach. So if you start from scratch, then go mobile first. And what this means is that you will start to do your designs for a mobile device, and then you will think about tablets later, and actually you will think about web pages later. So mobile, tablet, and then desktop, right? That would be the way you go. And in this way, it's much easier because here you know that you will use, maybe you will hide components, you don't need them, stuff like that, or the layouts are completely different because it's smaller, right, the screens. But then you go to tablet, maybe you want to show more things, more components, the details or something like that. And then, yeah, on the desktop version, even more. So, yeah, that's the way I would go. And then, of course, like when you build the components, so when we are building the components, I think you should always think about how to reuse them. So, for example, let's go to the image stuff. You know that you will start by doing a circle, and that's the first requirement. So you go with a circle, but you can think about, okay, maybe in the future we will have circles, but also squares. You can also have shades. You can have sizes. All of that you can think about, but first go with a simple thing, but always try to think a bit further just to see if it can scale. The same with the text, right? You can also think about alignments, sizes, etc. But here on the components level, I think also that you need to, for example, if you are building a bottom sheet or something like that, then you know that the bottom sheet is always a bottom sheet. And of course, maybe you have different bottom sheets in your applications, but the thing is, typically you want to express yourself with the same idea, right? The same bottom sheet or something like that. So then if you create a bottom sheet, you can always just create the component, and then you always reuse the same component, and the difference is on the content. So for example, this content has a title and some text and then an image or something like that, then you have a cross here, or even you have a cross, or even you have an handle here, and then you build all sort of animations. But the content can be basically anything, right? The bottom sheet is just an element that allows and gives you the animation, the scroll, it grows, or in the screen depending on the content size, for example, or there's a max height, for example, something like that. But then you always reuse these components. The same applies for models, for example, that appear in the screen. Then a model is always a model, and then of course you can always also mention that, okay, this model has these padding here, etc. And then you know that this will always be the case. Of course, you can also think about specifying these properties through the parent, so the model itself would when you are using it, then you specify the margins. But you can also say that no, for this case, every time is this padding. So then everyone that sends the content will not assign margins to that content. The content will be just whatever you want inside. So yeah, that way you can think about what is kind of the API contract on this case. So for example, if I want to force that every time this is the padding in this model, then I force it with hard-coded values. Otherwise, I will add the flexibility to specify them. And in that case, you can apply, I think, this idea to the bottom sheet. In this case, we are talking about a model, and of course, any other kind of main component, then you can always apply this, which is, I think, a nice approach. Of course, in the end, we already covered these kind of things, but before in previous videos. But for example, you should think about a theme. You should think about your colors. You should think about your spacings, right? And of course, you should think about margins and paddings, and these, for example, these three, they can be abstracted, right? So you always reuse your theme with all of these. Here we can also put the fonts, right? We already did this before. So theme, colors, fonts, spacings can be abstracted so that you always use the same constructs, and in that case um, you keep basically a way of doing it, and it's more consistent across your application. If you start to hard code, then you need to basically change everywhere where you hard coded your values. So that's nice to do in the beginning already, starting to see the common things and abstract it. Even if it's just for a different file that you can reuse everywhere, as we did, for example, with the theme and colors and spacings. That's a nice approach. And then for the margins and paddings, you can also find your solution to specify these things through your interfaces when you pass the properties, or you can also reuse a library because there's a lot of stuff already working for these kind of things. But if you go with your solution, then you can leverage TypeScript and the types to make it that, for example, in all your components, you already have some interface that you can pass, and where you only allow tweaking margins, tweaking paddings, tweaking the flex property and the grid property. So all the positioning, right? All the positioning that you need to do in your components, then that's a nice approach. But of course, as I mentioned, like sometimes reinventing the wheel is not a nice way. So you can also use libraries that already achieve that for your particular framework, because sometimes the framework is like using props, sometimes it uses something a little bit different, but the concepts in a way are a little bit the same. Like the component receives something as some behavior, and there are some characteristics or properties. But yeah, that's a nice way. And pretty much that's it. So of course, also here, for example, on this side, you can also think about, now I was just thinking about, you can also think about shadows, for example, right? Even though, then you also apply always the same shadows across your buttons, texts, wherever where you want to put shadows. That's nice stuff also to abstract. And one other thing that I wanted to do is that not all hard-coded stuff is bad, of course. So, for example, when we talk about smaller things, like let me see, like for example, you have a button and you want to put some so you have an image, for example, on the button, and then you have let me say a button like this, and then you want to put here some notification, for example. And of course, at this level, you will do something like the component will be, maybe it will be just the button, right, where some text is here. And you will create the component, then you create the text, then you create the image, and then you have these layout for the button. And of course, the button can be rounded, can be squared, maybe, right? And then you have the notification part. And of course, here you will probably go with an absolute positioning or something like that, where you put these one where you want it. And here, of course, there's some hard coding, because an hard coding of values, it's fine because it's within the component, right? So you are saying, for example, this is a relative component, then you put an absolute of minus top something, right something. That's okay, because it's basically within the component. So these kind of things, it's fine to achieve it with the hard-coded values, and it's hard maybe to achieve these with a flex or a grid or whatever. So in this case, it's fine because it's within the component. But when you, for example, say that you are doing an input and you put 200 pixels here, then it's hard, because if you want to reuse the component, and if it's not scaling depending on the space that the parent on the top has, right? Then it's hard, because if you want to create something a little bit bigger, and that you want your input to basically fill in that gap of the new space that he has on the new parent, then it's hard because it's hard coded on the component level. So what you would go here with is basically with Flex, for example, because you can with Flex properties you can basically say, yeah, take the most of the or take all the space that the parent gives me, and then you take it, and then you can do ratios between the flex items, for example. So that's the way to go. So the 200 we should avoid. So that's the hard-coded values that I think you should avoid is this kind of things. But for example, for these kind of situations where you basically want to position your elements, then it's okay to hard-code some values. I don't know. This is just an example, of course. There's other examples where you would also hard code values. So, for example, if you have always the same buttons and you know that the buttons will have like, for example, imagine that you have a button which you will know it's always 16 pixels. Then you have another button which is like 24 or 32, and then you could also have 64. Then this is okay to hard code, and of course maybe you just have some properties which will give these sizes for the buttons, for example, because you know that it will not expand, right? It's always like this. And you just reuse them depending on for example, if it's an mobile application, you know that you will go with 16 pixels for some kinds of buttons, 24, 32, or 64. Then you know it, and when it's a small number of things that you want to hard code, and it's okay. But yeah, I think you get the point of these avoiding the hard coded part. And yeah, I think this pretty much will cover the whole thing about creating the components. And then another thing I think it's like if you are building something which mobile application, a web application that you know that it will not be just an experimental thing that you are working on for learning something or something like that, it will be growing, right? It will grow. So another thing that I always think that it's nice to go and use, you will need some sort of navigation, right? And of course here you can reuse navigation. I mean, navigate between screens on your apps or on your web. That's nice that you kind of have a library, or you follow your own, you create your own library to do these kind of things. And then another one is the state management. The state management is also something that I think it's nice to use a library for, because and here we can think about Redux, you can think about Mobex, a lot of libraries there are out there that help you with that, and this can be used for different things. You can use for listing your users, for example, right? You create the users, you put the users there. You can also do some sort of behavior management, right? So for example, I am tweaking some aspect of the whole app. For example, we did this with the bottom sheets, right, where you wanted to put some black screen below the whole thing, and then this is a nice place where you can have some configurations for your whole application or web application. So the state management is, for me, it's always nice to have. And of course, then you have the theme and the abstractions that we talked about before. Pretty much that's it. Cool. So now you should know some tips that can help you when you develop your web apps or mobile apps, and specifically more your components. If you follow these rules, I think you will be able to create your components and then reuse them while you develop your app and add more features in a more quick way. And of course, you can also think about then abstracting away your components to a library. And then, of course, if you want to develop multiple apps, then you just swap some colors, some fonts, and some shapes here and there, and you are good to go, right? You create another app based on these components that you created. There are a lot of technologies, a lot of solutions, a lot of ways of doing it, but still, if you follow these kind of things, probably you will get there. But of course, it's always a challenge, and it's always difficult, and it takes practice. And even though with practice, and you will always mess up somewhere. So, but that's fine. That's fine. And yeah, but eventually you'll get there. And of course, if you like this kind of videos, please think about subscribing and giving a like, because it helps grow the channel. And also, if you have any thoughts or even suggestions, please drop them in the comments down below. Till next time, keep in the loop.